Silence in a lawyer's office is rarely peaceful. It is heavy with greed and unspoken resentments. When Arthur Pendleton's immense estate was divided, his estranged grandson Leo sat in the corner, expecting nothing. He was right, until a rusted key and a sealed envelope flipped the entire family dynasty upside down. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling, Hayes and Partners, a high-powered law firm perched on the 34th floor overlooking downtown Boston. Inside the mahogany-paneled conference room, the air was suffocatingly thick with the scent of expensive Tom Ford cologne, nervous sweat, and unadulterated avarice. Leo Pendleton sat as far away from the massive oak table as the room would allow, his worn leather boots resting softly against the edge of a priceless Persian rug. At 28, Leo was the glaring anomaly in the room, while the rest of the Pendleton clan was draped in tailored Armani suits and subtly flashing Cartier watches. Leo wore a simple, faded chambray shirt and a corduroy jacket. He worked as a custom furniture builder in a quiet shop in Vermont, a life he had chosen specifically to put as much distance as possible between himself and the toxic orbit of his family's wealth. He was only here because his grandfather, Arthur Pendleton, had explicitly requested his presence in his final hours. Arthur, a titan of industry who had built Pendleton Freight and Logistics from a single rusted delivery truck into a multi-billion-dollar empire, had passed away 2 weeks prior. Across the room sat Leo's aunt, Beatrice. She was a woman whose face had been pulled and tucked so many times that her expressions were limited to a permanent, condescending sneer. She was aggressively tapping a manicured fingernail against the screen of her phone, her eyes darting impatiently toward the closed oak doors. Beside her was her husband, Gerald, a remarkably quiet man who served mostly as a prop to hold her designer coats. "I still don't understand why everyone had to be dragged here," Beatrice muttered loudly enough for the entire room to hear, casting a sideways, venomous glance at Leo. Dad's wishes were always perfectly clear to those of us who actually remained in his life. "Let it go, Bea," muttered Uncle Richard, Arthur's eldest son. Richard was pacing the length of the room, running a hand through his thinning hair. Unlike Beatrice, who simply wanted the validation of being the favorite, Richard desperately needed the money. The financial press had been running quiet rumors for months that his independent venture capital firm was wildly overleveraged, bleeding cash, and on the verge of total insolvency. Richard's left leg bounced with a frantic, rhythmic anxiety. "Thomas Sterling is a professional. He'll read the document, we'll sign the papers, and we can all move on with our lives." Slumped in a plush leather armchair near the window was cousin Chloe, Richard's 22-year-old daughter. She was currently filming a silent video of herself for her massive social media following, pouting her lips and ensuring the somber lighting caught her cheekbones. To her, her grandfather's death was a tragic aesthetic to be monetized, a brief hiatus before the massive trust fund kicked in, and she could finalize the purchase of her new penthouse in Tribeca. Leo kept his eyes locked on the rain streaking down the glass. He didn't care about the money. He had never cared. When his own father, David, Arthur's youngest and clearly favored son, died in a car accident 15 years ago, Beatrice and Richard had immediately swooped in to secure their positions in the family hierarchy. They had manipulated an aging, grieving Arthur into believing that Leo's mother was trying to siphon the family fortune, resulting in a bitter, jagged estrangement. Leo had spent the last decade entirely cut off from the Pendleton wealth, building a quiet, honest life with his own 2 hands. He hadn't seen his grandfather in 5 years. The guilt of that absence chewed at the edges of Leo's conscience, a dull ache in his chest that the hostility in the room only magnified. He had come to pay his respects to the memory of the man who used to teach him how to carve wooden boats on the porch of the Nantucket summer house, not to beg for scraps from a fortune he wanted no part of. The heavy oak doors finally clicked open, and the low hum of hostile murmurs abruptly ceased. Thomas Sterling, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and the rigid, unyielding posture of a seasoned litigator, walked into the room. He carried a thick leather portfolio and a small, strangely worn wooden box. Sterling didn't offer empty condolences or warm smiles. He walked directly to the head of the table, adjusted his reading glasses, and sat down. "Good afternoon," Sterling said, his voice a dry, gravelly baritone that commanded instant silence. "We are here to execute the final will and testament of Arthur James Pendleton. As per his strict instructions, this meeting is being recorded, and the terms of this document are final." He included a standard ironclad no contest clause. "Anyone who attempts to challenge the distribution of this estate will instantly forfeit their share." "Completely." Richard stopped pacing and quickly took a seat. Beatrice sat up straighter, adjusting the enormous diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. Chloe finally put her phone away, her eyes widening with sudden, sharp interest. Leo remained in the corner, crossing his arms, preparing himself for the circus to begin. He knew exactly how this was going to go. Beatrice and Richard were about to carve up an empire, and they were going to do it with smiles on their faces. Thomas Sterling unclasped the leather portfolio, the sharp snap echoing loudly in the quiet room. He withdrew a thick stack of heavy parchment papers, smoothing them out flat against the desk. "I will spare you the standard legal preamble and cut straight to the distributions, as Arthur requested," Sterling began, looking over the rims of his glasses. He was very specific about how he wanted his life's work divided. Beatrice leaned forward, practically vibrating with anticipation. "To my daughter, Beatrice Pendleton," Sterling read, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. "I leave the primary family estate in Beacon Hill, all of its contents, and the Nantucket summer residence. I also leave the sum of $45 million to be transferred immediately from my personal holdings." Beatrice let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a decade. A triumphant, gloating smile spread across her face. She had won the houses. She was the undisputed matriarch of the family now. "To my son, Richard Pendleton," Sterling continued, turning a page. "I leave my controlling 60% stake of voting shares in Pendleton Freight and Logistics, along with the contents of my offshore portfolios, valued at approximately $90 million. It is my hope that you finally learn to balance a ledger, Richard." Richard closed his eyes, his shoulders dropping 2 inches as a wave of profound, desperate relief washed over him. The debt that had been suffocating him was gone. He was safe. He was rich beyond measure. He shot a smug, knowing look toward Beatrice, silently declaring that he was the true heir to the empire. "To my granddaughter Chloe," Sterling read. "I leave a trust fund in the amount of $20 million, which will disperse in increments over the next 10 years, provided she completes a degree from an accredited university." Chloe scoffed softly. "A degree? Seriously? Doesn't he know I have 3 million followers?" she whispered to her father, but the complaint was half-hearted. 20 million was 20 million. Sterling flipped the final page. The room suddenly grew deathly quiet. All eyes, heavy with a mix of curiosity and disdain, slowly shifted toward the corner of the room where Leo sat. Leo kept his face perfectly impassive. He expected nothing, perhaps a nominal sum of a few $1,000 just to prevent any legal loopholes, or simply to be left out entirely. Sterling paused, clearing his throat. For the first time since he entered the room, the sharp-eyed lawyer looked slightly uncomfortable. He reached over and placed his hand on the battered, heavily scratched wooden box he had brought in with him. And finally, to my grandson, Leo Pendleton, Sterling read, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave, the son of my beloved David. Leo, you chose to walk away from this family. You chose to build your own life, entirely separate from the legacy I created. I have always respected a man who works with his hands. Therefore, I leave you no money. I leave you no property. I leave you no shares in my company. A sharp, cruel bark of laughter escaped Beatrice's lips before she could stop herself. She covered her mouth, her eyes gleaming with absolute malicious delight. Richard smirked, shaking his head as if pitying a fool. Even Chloe looked at Leo with a mixture of amusement and second-hand embarrassment. Sterling continued, ignoring the family's reaction. Instead, I leave you this box, and the single item contained within it. It is entirely worthless to anyone but me. May it serve as a reminder of the life you chose. Sterling picked up the small wooden box and slid it across the long mahogany table. It stopped near the center. The silence in the room was excruciating. It wasn't just an omission. It was a deliberate, calculated insult. Arthur had used his dying words to publicly humiliate the grandson who had dared to survive outside the family's financial control. Beatrice leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Well, I suppose that concludes the business of the day. A very fitting end, don't you think, Richard? Quite, Richard agreed, buttoning his suit jacket, already looking at his phone to message his brokers. Arthur always did have a sharp sense of justice. Leo felt a hot flush of anger rise in his chest, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him bleed. He uncrossed his legs, stood up slowly, and walked toward the table. The eyes of his aunt and uncle tracked him, waiting for a breakdown, waiting for a tantrum. Leo reached out and took the small wooden box. It was surprisingly heavy, the wood deeply scarred and smelling faintly of motor oil and old pine. He flipped the brass latch and opened it. Inside rested a single, heavily rusted iron key. It was old, the kind of heavy skeleton key that belonged to a 19th century farmhouse, not a modern Boston penthouse or a corporate vault. Beneath the key was a faded, folded piece of paper. Leo stared at the rusted metal. He felt a sudden, crushing weight of grief. It wasn't about the money. It was the realization that his grandfather had died, still harboring bitterness toward him. He had held on to a petty grudge to the very end. Leo snapped the box shut. He didn't look at Beatrice. He didn't look at Richard. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Leo said, his voice steady, devoid of the tremor he felt inside. He turned his back on the billions of dollars sitting at the table and began walking toward the heavy oak doors, desperate to get out of this suffocating room, out of Boston, and back to his workshop in the mountains where things made sense. He had his hand on the brass doorknob when Thomas Sterling's voice suddenly shattered the triumphant atmosphere in the room. "Mr. Pendleton," Sterling called out. It wasn't the dry, legal tone from before. It was sharp, urgent. Leo stopped, glancing over his shoulder. Sterling was standing up, ignoring Beatrice and Richard entirely. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit and withdrew a thick, wax-sealed envelope. "I apologize, Leo, but you cannot leave just yet," Sterling said, his eyes locking onto Leo's. "What I just read was the public will, the distribution of the known assets. But Arthur left me with very strict instructions regarding a secondary protocol." Beatrice's smile vanished instantly. "A secondary protocol? What are you talking about, Thomas? You just distributed the estate." Sterling didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed firmly on the young man by the door. "Arthur instructed me to let your aunt and uncle claim their inheritances first, to let them believe the ledger was closed. Sterling said quietly, the weight of his words sucking all the air out of the room. And then he instructed me to give you this, the real inheritance, the one that isn't on any public record. The temperature in the mahogany-panelled conference room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. Beatrice's face, previously flushed with the triumph of her newfound matriarchy, drained of all colour. She gripped the edge of the heavy oak table so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, bony white. "What secondary protocol?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking slightly, the confident swagger of a CEO instantly evaporating. He stepped toward Thomas Sterling, his eyes darting frantically between the lawyer and the thick, wax-sealed envelope. Arthur's assets were fully documented. I've seen the corporate filings. I've seen the estate ledgers. There is no secondary anything. Sterling adjusted his glasses, completely unbothered by Richard's rising panic. He possessed the impenetrable calm of a man who had navigated the turbulent waters of billionaire family disputes for 4 decades. "You have seen the public ledgers, Richard," Sterling corrected mildly, his gravelly voice echoing in the tense silence. "The assets Arthur wanted you to see. As I mentioned, Arthur was a titan of industry. He did not build a multi-billion-dollar logistics empire by being transparent with his competitors, or, with all due respect, with his family." Sterling extended the envelope toward Leo. The crimson wax seal bore the heavy, familiar crest of the Pendleton family, a ship's wheel intertwined with an anchor. Leo hesitated. His hand hovered over the parchment. He had spent the last 10 years convincing himself he wanted nothing to do with these people, nothing to do with the money that had warped his aunt and uncle into monsters of greed. But looking at the wax seal, he felt a strange, undeniable pull. It was the last communication from the man who used to carve wooden boats with him on the porch in Nantucket. He took the envelope. It felt heavy, loaded with the weight of unspeakable secrets. "Break the seal, Leo," Sterling instructed quietly. "This is absurd," Beatrice shrieked, finally finding her voice. She stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "He's a carpenter. He hasn't spoken to my father in 5 years. Thomas, I will have your license for this. I will tie this firm up in litigation until you are bankrupt. Beatrice, I strongly advise you to sit down and remember the no contest clause I read to you 10 minutes ago," Sterling snapped, his tone suddenly sharp as a razor. "Challenge this, and the Beacon Hill estate goes entirely to charity. Not a single cent to you." Beatrice froze, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish before she slowly, furiously, lowered herself back into her seat. Chloe, the influencer cousin, had completely abandoned her phone, watching the scene unfold with wide, terrified eyes. The comfortable narrative of her life was suddenly cracking at the foundations. Leo broke the wax seal. The crisp snap echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He pulled out a few sheets of heavy, cream-colored paper, covered in his grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, a sharp, looping cursive that had barely degraded with age. "Leo," the letter began. Leo read the words silently, the hostility of the room fading into a distant hum as his grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have just endured the grotesque spectacle of watching your aunt and uncle gorge themselves on what they believe is my life's work. I know you didn't want to come today. I know you only came out of a sense of duty, a trait you inherited from your father, David. He was the best of us. I owe you a profound apology, my boy. When David died, my grief blinded me. I allowed Richard and Beatrice to whisper poison into my ear about your mother. I let their greed isolate me from the only grandson who actually possessed an ounce of integrity. I watched from afar as you built a life with your own hands, rejecting the toxic inheritance of the Pendleton name. I was too proud, too stubborn to admit my terrible mistake while I was alive. For that, I am eternally sorry. But I am a businessman, Leo, and I do not leave loose ends. You heard Thomas read the public will. I gave Beatrice the houses. I gave Richard the company. They believe they have won. They believe they hold the power. What Richard does not know, what he has been too arrogant and lazy to investigate during his frantic scrambling to save his own bankrupt venture capital firm, is that Pendleton Freight and Logistics does not own its own infrastructure. 20 years ago, foreseeing the rot creeping into this family, I quietly moved the patents for our proprietary routing software, the deeds to our 50 major distribution hubs, and the leaseholds for our entire fleet of cargo ships into a private, anonymous holding company called the Ironwood Trust. Pendleton Freight is merely a shell, a tenant. Richard now owns a company that leases everything it uses from Ironwood, and the lease expires in 30 days. Beatrice's beloved Beacon Hill estate? The land it sits on is also owned by Ironwood. Her Nantucket house? Ironwood. I gave them the crown, Leo, but the crown is made of paper. I am leaving you the kingdom. The rusted key in the wooden box I gave you does not open a vault. It opens safe deposit box number 402 at the First National Bank in Concord, New Hampshire. Inside that box are the sole bearer shares of the Ironwood Trust. By taking possession of those documents, you become the outright owner of the infrastructure that holds Richard and Beatrice's entire existence together. You can renew the leases and let them continue their hollow, wealthy masquerade. Or you can crush them. You can evict them, liquidate the assets, and take every single cent of the $3 billion Ironwood is worth. The choice is yours. It is a heavy burden, but it is the only way I could ensure that the true power of this family rests in hands calloused by honest work, rather than hands softened by greed. Forgive an old man his dramatic flair. Build something beautiful, Leo. Love, Grandpa Arthur. Leo stopped reading. His breathing had slowed. The magnitude of what he was holding, of what was sitting in his pocket in the form of a rusted iron key, was staggering. It wasn't just money. It was absolute, unmitigated leverage over the people who had made his mother's life a living hell. He looked up. Richard and Beatrice were staring at him, their faces masks of desperate curiosity and dawning horror. They didn't know the specifics, but they could see the tectonic shift in power written in the calm, steady gaze of the nephew they had just been laughing at. "What does it say?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling. "Leo, what did he give you?" Leo carefully folded the letter and slid it into the inner pocket of his corduroy jacket. He picked up the battered wooden box from the table. He looked at his uncle. He saw a man drowning in debt, clutching at a sinking ship he believed was a luxury liner. He looked at Beatrice, a woman whose entire identity was tied to properties she no longer technically controlled. "He gave me an apology," Leo said softly. He didn't explain. He didn't gloat. He turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, and this time, Thomas Sterling didn't stop him. As Leo stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the law firm, he could hear the muffled, frantic shouting of his family erupting behind the closed doors. The drive to Concord, New Hampshire, took less than 2 hours, but to Leo, it felt like crossing a lifetime. The relentless rain that had battered Boston gave way to a crisp, clear New England afternoon, the sun breaking through the clouds to illuminate the dense forests lining the highway. His beat-up Ford truck rattled slightly as he pulled into the quaint, historic downtown of Concord. He parked down the street from the First National Bank, a modest, brick-and-mortar institution, that looked like it hadn't changed its decor since the 1970s. It was the exact opposite of the towering glass financial institutions Richard frequented. It was quiet. It was hidden. Leo walked inside, the bell above the door chiming softly. He presented his identification and the rusted key to a grey-haired bank manager who seemed entirely unsurprised by his arrival. "Mr. Pendleton," the manager said warmly, checking a ledger. "Your grandfather said you'd be coming eventually. Right this way." He was led into the basement, into a small vault lined with steel boxes. The manager pointed to box number 402, nodded respectfully, and left Leo alone in the cool, silent room. Leo inserted the rusted skeleton key into the heavy lock. It turned with a satisfying, metallic click. He pulled the long metal drawer out and carried it to a small viewing table. Inside the box lay a thick stack of legal documents, bound by a heavy leather strap. On top was a single certificate, printed on thick, watermark-embedded paper. The Ironwood Trust. Bearer of this document retains 100% controlling interest. Beneath it was a detailed ledger. Leo flipped through the pages, his eyes widening at the staggering numbers. Billions of dollars in real estate, intellectual property, and liquid assets. Arthur had systematically, brilliantly, hollowed out his own company over 2 decades, siphoning the true value into this impregnable fortress, leaving behind a hollow shell for Richard to inherit. Leo sat back in the metal chair, staring at the ceiling of the vault. The power was intoxicating. He imagined the look on Beatrice's face when she received an eviction notice for the Beacon Hill estate. He pictured Richard's complete mental collapse when he realized Pendleton Freight owed billions in back rent to a company entirely controlled by the nephew he had discarded. He could destroy them with a single phone call to Thomas Sterling. He could avenge his mother, punish their greed, and take his place as a billionaire tycoon. But as he sat there in the quiet vault, the smell of old paper and metal filling his lungs, he looked down at his own hands. They were scarred from slipping chisels, stained with wood stain, rough and strong. If he used this power to crush them, he would be playing their game. He would be stepping into the venomous cycle of vengeance and corporate warfare that had consumed his grandfather's life and alienated his family. He would become a Pendleton in the worst sense of the word. Arthur had written, "Build something beautiful, Leo." Leo smiled. The anger that had festered in his chest for a decade finally began to evaporate, replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He wouldn't evict Beatrice, but he would transfer the ownership of the houses into an irrevocable trust that dictated she could never sell them, forcing her to live in the gilded cage she so desperately coveted, but removing her power to leverage it. He wouldn't bankrupt Richard immediately. He would renew the leases for Pendleton Freight, but at a newly negotiated exorbitant premium. The profits from those leases would bypass Richard entirely, flowing directly from Ironwood into a massive foundation Leo would create, a foundation dedicated to funding vocational schools, supporting independent craftsmen, and protecting rural forests from corporate logging. Richard would have his title as CEO. He would have his corner office and his custom suits, but he would spend the rest of his life unknowingly working as a middle management employee, generating billions in revenue that Leo would quietly funnel into doing good for the world. They would have their hollow crowns, and Leo would have his peace. He packed the documents back into the box, save for the master certificate of ownership, which he folded and placed securely into his jacket pocket. He locked the box, returned it to the wall, and walked out of the bank into the bright afternoon sun. He didn't drive south toward Boston, toward the high-rises and the boardrooms. He got into his truck, rolled down the windows, and drove north, heading back to the mountains, back to his workshop, and back to the life he had built with his own 2 hands. Leo never moved into a penthouse or bought a sports car. He stayed in his Vermont workshop, the sawdust a comforting reminder of honest labor. But behind the scenes, he became the quiet guardian of the Pendleton legacy, dismantling Richard's toxic empire and funding local artisans. He learned that true wealth isn't found in corporate boardrooms or offshore accounts, but in the quiet freedom of choosing your own path.